How did the heart and drugs contribute to the cause of death?
They contributed to Mr. Floyd having a sudden cardiac arrest in my opinion. Mr. Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia or cardiac arrhythmia. The fentanyl and methamphetamine, exposure to a vehicle exhaust, potentially carbon monoxide poisoning.
How do you know the car was even on?
So many conflicting potential mechanisms of death.
Mr. Floyd then is sandwiched in a way between Mr. Chauvin on top and the asphalt pavement beneath him, right? It's a yes or no question.
Yes.
And good evening, I'm Michael Onish. You're watching HLN's breaking news coverage of the death of George Floyd. Derek Chauvin on trial. All new this hour. A pathologist called by the defense contradicting a slew of prosecution testimony. How George Floyd died, his manner of death, and if he was really eating pills when police approached him in 2020. But first, here are the headlines. Dr. David Fowler took the stand this morning and made some compelling and contradictory statements about how George Floyd died. He led off by saying the cause of death was, quote, undetermined. And he said Chauvin's knee did not impact any of George Floyd's vital structures. And lastly, he said George Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. Our Camilla Bernal is in Minneapolis leading us off tonight.
The forensic pathologist telling the jury that he believes that the cause of death here should have been undetermined and not a homicide, and he points to a number of factors as contributing to George Floyd's death, including the use of drugs, the heart disease, and possibly even carbon monoxide poisoning. During his direct examination, he, for the most part, stayed away from the knee on the neck.
Bottom line is he has an enlarged heart.
Maryland's former chief medical examiner testifying as an expert witness as the defense attempts to establish an alternative theory of George Floyd's death.
How did the heart and drugs contribute to the cause of death?
They were significant.
Dr. David Fowler telling the jury Floyd's drug use, prior health conditions, and potential exposure to carbon monoxide from the exhaust pipe of a police vehicle
contributed to Mr. Floyd having a sudden cardiac arrest.
The prosecution disagrees, blaming Floyd's death on Derek Chauvin's actions.
The defendant's conduct was a causal factor in bringing about Mr. Floyd's death.
And on the second day of the defense's presentation, attorney Eric Nelson looking to bring a quick end to the trial.
For a judgment of acquittal in this particular case, the state has essentially introduced doubt in the context of providing multiple opinions from multiple experts, all of which seem to contradict each other.
Taken as a whole, the state believes that it's established and will establish beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of all charges.
I'm going to deny the defense motion for judgment of acquittal.
The defense is expected to rest its case as soon as the end of the week. And back to this expert. In cross-examination, the prosecution asking him if he had done his homework. Right off the bat, they were able to get him to admit that he had not taken into consideration the weight of the equipment that Derek Chauvin was carrying that day. They also got him to admit that there is no evidence to show carbon monoxide poisoning, but he did go a little bit further, saying that no tests on this were conducted. Reporting in Minneapolis, I'm Camila Bernal. Back to you.
All right, Camila, thanks. And let's pick up there. You heard some of the direct examination. Now the prosecutor, Jerry Blackwell, takes over. Let's listen.
When you were observing the footage of Mr. Floyd after he's gone unconscious, there's a point in time where you see his legs raise up. Do you recall seeing his legs raised at the point after he was unconscious on the ground?
Yes.
Was that leg raising, was that consistent with what's known as an anoxic seizure?
That is what we would typically call it, yes.
And an anoxic seizure typically represents that there has been some damage to the brainstem due to insufficient oxygen. True?
It's anoxics, or in some cases we would call it hypoxic seizure, and it's not damage to the brainstem. It means that the part of the brain that governs our actual muscular movement, which is the higher portion of the brain, is not functioning properly. So typically people with seizure disorders who have seizure activity, it's from the motor cortex and not from down at the brainstem. If you've damaged the brainstem at that particular stage, the person is effectively going to be deceased.
So, but it's fair to say when we see an anoxic seizure, at the very least, we know that the brain is suffering from insufficient oxygen.
Yes.
Do you agree that low oxygen in the body, insufficient oxygen, it can cause brain injury, can't it?
Absolutely.
And it can also result in PEA, pulseless electrical activity, true?
True.
Now, Mr. Floyd had a PEA, a pulseless electrical activity arrhythmia, when his body was taken away from the scene on May 25th, 2020, didn't he?
Correct.
Is it true, Dr. Fowler, that the most common cause of a PEA is low oxygen, insufficient oxygen?
To the brain?
Yes, sir.
Yes, which can also be caused by a cardiac standstill. So no oxygen to the brain from either mechanism will cause PEA.
Were you aware of whether or not Mr. Floyd was experiencing being choked as he was being put into the back of Squad 320?
I did not see a limb around his neck.
Do you see where I've circled, Dr. Fowler?
Yes.
And do you see this arm that is around Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
Do you recognize this person to be Mr. Chauvin?
It appears to be yes.
And if I could show you 281. I'm sorry, Don, if you could. And here we see the top of Mr. Floyd's face. And then there's a hand here on his neck. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so you, these weren't images or scenes that you had paid special attention to before as you looked at what was going on in Squad 320? You had not seen any arms or anything around Mr. Floyd's neck?
No, I'd seen these particular sections. I'm sorry if I misinterpreted your question. You said before he went into Squad 320. I apologize if I misinterpreted your question.
And so do you know whether when Mr. Floyd was into the back of Squad 320 and before he's pulled out, whether he complained about being choked? Did he say, "I'm getting choked"?
I believe he did, yes.
And it doesn't take a medical doctor such as yourself to know that if somebody feeling that they are getting choked, well, that would be a good reason why they would say they can't breathe.
Yes.
Was there ever a time when, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, where you saw Mr. Floyd either sleepy, unarousable, or anything that's akin to being in a coma?
No, not until he lost consciousness.
And typically, doctor, when somebody passes away from a fentanyl or opioid overdose, one of the hallmarks of that is that they are very sleepy, and they will tend to be unarousable and pass away in essentially a coma, right?
Correct. If they are passing away from fentanyl overdose, that's what happens.
Now, we're going to let you listen to more of key testimony from this witness, because what's at stake is cause of death that could decide the case. This witness says the cause of death mainly is cardiovascular disease. Prosecution says no, it was the actions of the officers. You listen, you decide. That's coming up. There you were looking at the actual autopsy done by Dr. Andrew Baker. Manner of death, homicide, cause of death, basically the subdual and restraint done by officers, i.e. Derek Chauvin. Well, Dr. David Fowler, he goes the other way. Manner of death undetermined. He's on the stand for hours today and beginning his testimony for the defense by laying blame for George Floyd's death on everything from drugs to hypertension, even carbon monoxide, vehicle exhaust. He also made note of a white object in George Floyd's mouth just before he was taken into custody by police. Let's listen.
So in my opinion, Mr. Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia due to his atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, or you can write that down multiple different ways, during his restraint and subdual by the police, or restraint by the police. And then his significant contributory conditions would be, since I've already put the heart disease in part 1, he would have the toxicology, the fentanyl and methamphetamine. There is exposure to a vehicle exhaust, so potentially carbon monoxide poisoning, or at least an effect from increased carbon monoxide in his bloodstream, and paraganglionoma, or the other natural disease process that he has. So all of those combined to cause Mr. Floyd's death.
And what injuries did you observe in the photographs of Mr. Floyd?
All of his injuries were in areas where the knee was not. In other words, they were on the front of his body, his face, his places where he was restrained, but there was absolutely no evidence of any injury on the skin, to the subcutaneous tissue, or the deeper structures of the back or the neck.
Were there any broken bones, spinal injuries, anything of that nature?
There were no broken bones documented. I did not see a description of the spinal cord in the autopsy report, but given that there was really no external evidence of the area, the muscles around the spinal column, I would be very surprised if there was any spinal cord injury in this particular case.
So you referenced the back of Mr. Floyd. Did you see any bruising to the skin?
I did not see bruising or abrasion to the skin.
Did you see any bleeding into the subcutaneous tissues of the neck and back?
No, not on the autopsy photographs, nor was it documented in the autopsy.
How about to the muscles?
The same.
And so in your opinion, the absence of such injury, how does that speak to the cause of death?
It speaks to the amount of force that was applied to Mr. Floyd was less than enough to bruise him.
So in this image, doctor, it's kind of hard to see. What, in your review, did you determine whether there was the possibility that controlled substances were ingested at the time of approach by officers King and Lane?
Yes.
And what do you see in this image, 1059, that is consistent with that?
In the back corner of Mr. Floyd's mouth, you can see what appears to be a white object.
See if I can. Are you talking this object right there? Oops.
Just slightly higher up than that, yes.
Can't. Well, why don't you do it?
Sorry, I covered it with the dot, but that's what I'm referring to.
All right.
You see it just underneath the dot.
Now, in the next image, 1060, what appears to be happening?
In this particular image, it appears that Mr. Floyd is looking away, away from, from Officer Lane.
And looking at the timestamps, that's approximately 1 second later.
Yes.
And in the third image, does he appear to be looking at Officer Lane again?
Yes.
And do you see that
same object in his mouth.
I can, yes.
In terms of the later analysis, there, you understand there was some evidence collected from the backseat of Squad 320?
That is my understanding, yes.
And do you know what that substance was?
There was some material there that had saliva and DNA on it that matched Mr. Floyd, and those, I believe, and those objects had fentanyl and methamphetamine, if my memory serves me correctly.
So is that what you conclude your analysis on in terms of the ingestion of controlled substances as far as the timing in this case? Both before they were approached as well as during, in the backseat of the squad car?
Yes.
All right, coming up, you're going to hear an intense cross-examination, but a point made beyond cause of death could have been the most important of all. You'll hear that coming up.